A mail-order bride came covered in bruises. Then the rancher told her, "You're coming with me." The morning train arrived in a cloud of dust and steam, just as it always did, but that day felt different to everyone standing on the small wooden platform. The town was quiet except for the hiss of the engine and the distant sound of wind moving across the dry fields. A few townsfolk had gathered out of curiosity. News traveled fast in a place where not much ever changed, and they all knew a mail-order bride was arriving. Thomas Hale stood slightly apart from the others. He wasn't a man who enjoyed attention. Tall and broad-shouldered, with hands rough from years of ranch work, he kept his hat low over his eyes. He had placed the advertisement months ago after long evenings of thinking it over by the fire. Ranch life was lonely. The days were long, and the nights were even longer. He had not been looking for someone to control or impress. He had been hoping for companionship. Someone to share meals with, someone to talk to after the sun went down. The train slowed with a loud screech of metal against metal. Steam rose around the wheels as it came to a stop. A conductor stepped down first, then a few passengers followed. An older couple. A traveling salesman with a leather case. A young mother holding a sleepy child. Then she appeared. She stepped carefully down from the train as if unsure the ground would hold her. She wore a pale dress that had once been neat but now looked wrinkled from the long journey. Her boots were dusty. In one hand she held a small suitcase that looked older than she was. It seemed too light to carry a whole life inside. At first glance, she looked like any other young woman traveling alone. But when she adjusted the sleeve of her dress, the crowd noticed the marks on her arm. Dark bruises, fading at the edges but still clear. A faint shadow near her jawline, partly hidden by a scarf. The whispers started almost immediately. Thomas heard them, but he didn't turn toward the sound. His eyes were fixed on her face. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from travel, but the kind that comes from carrying fear for too long. Her gaze moved quickly across the platform, scanning faces, as if she expected someone dangerous to appear at any moment. For a second, she looked like she might step back onto the train. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. This was not what he had imagined. In her letters, she had written politely. She had described growing up in a small village, helping her mother sew clothes and tend a garden. She had written about wanting a fresh start and a stable home. Her handwriting had been neat but careful, like someone afraid to take up too much space on the page. He had never asked about her past. He believed people would share what they wanted when they were ready. Now, standing a few steps away from her, he realized there was much more to her story than ink on paper. The conductor called out final instructions, and the train gave a warning whistle. If she didn't move soon, it would leave without her. Thomas stepped forward. The wooden boards creaked under his boots. She noticed him immediately and stiffened. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her suitcase. For a brief moment, fear flashed in her eyes. Not fear of him exactly, but fear of what might happen next. He stopped at a respectful distance. "Eliza?" he asked gently. She hesitated before nodding. "Yes." Her voice was soft, almost fragile, but steady enough to show she was trying to be brave. "I'm Thomas Hale," he said. "You made a long journey." Another small nod. Up close, he could see that the bruises were not fresh, but they were not old either. They told a story of recent hardship. He felt anger rise inside him, but he kept his expression calm. This moment was not about his feelings. It was about making sure she felt safe. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her suitcase. She looked surprised that he had asked permission. After a pause, she handed it to him slowly. It was lighter than he expected. The train let out a loud hiss, and she flinched at the sound. The reaction was quick and instinctive. Thomas noticed. He said nothing about it. The platform had grown quiet. The townsfolk who had come for entertainment were now watching something they didn't fully understand. Some looked concerned. Others looked curious. A few simply shook their heads, already forming opinions. Thomas didn't care about any of that. "You're coming with me," he said. His voice was calm but firm. There was no force in it, no demand, just certainty. A promise that she would not be left standing alone on that platform. She studied his face as if trying to decide whether to trust him. The wind lifted a loose strand of her hair. For a long second, neither of them moved. Then she gave the smallest nod. The train whistle blew again, louder this time, and the engine began to pull away. Smoke drifted into the sky as the cars rolled forward. She turned her head slightly, watching it leave. Whatever life she had stepped away from was disappearing down the tracks. Thomas adjusted his grip on the suitcase and stepped aside, giving her space to walk next to him instead of behind him. As they moved off the platform, the whispers followed. "Did you see her arms? She looks like she's been through something. I hope he knows what he's doing." Thomas kept walking. They reached his wagon, parked near the edge of the station. Two sturdy horses waited patiently, flicking their tails against flies. The open land stretched beyond them, wide and endless. The ranch was miles away, surrounded by rolling fields and open sky. He set her suitcase gently in the back of the wagon. "It's a bit of a ride," he said, "but the road's smooth." She nodded again. Words seemed difficult for her, as if speaking too much might cause something to break. He offered his hand to help her into the wagon. She hesitated for a split second before placing her hand in his. Her skin felt cold despite the warm morning air. He helped her climb up without pulling or rushing her. When she was seated, he stepped back and walked around to the driver's side. He climbed up and took the reins. The horses began to move. For a while, the only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves against dirt and the creak of wooden wheels. The town slowly faded behind them. Buildings became smaller. Voices disappeared. Soon, it was just open land. Eliza sat straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes kept drifting to the horizon, then back to the road behind them, as if checking to make sure no one was following. Thomas noticed but didn't comment. "You don't have to talk," he said after a few minutes. "Not until you're ready." She looked at him, surprised again. Most men she had known filled silence quickly. They asked questions. They expected answers. They demanded explanations. He simply guided the horses and let the quiet exist. After some time, she spoke. "Is it far?" "About an hour," he replied. "The ranch sits near a small creek, plenty of open space." She absorbed that information silently. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of dry grass and earth. The sky above them was wide and blue, stretching farther than she had ever seen before. There were no tall buildings, no crowded streets, just land and sky. Something in her shoulders seemed to relax just a little. As they rode, Thomas allowed himself a brief glance at her again. The marks on her skin told him that whatever had happened, it had not been small. He felt a strong urge to ask who had hurt her, but he held back. Trust was not built through questions forced too soon. Instead, he said, "There's fresh bread at the house, and clean water. You can rest as long as you need." Her fingers tightened again at the word rest, as if rest had been something rare. "Thank you," she said quietly. The wagon rolled forward, carrying them farther from the station and closer to something unknown. Behind them, the train tracks cut a straight line through the land, a reminder of where she had come from. Ahead of them, the ranch waited. And though neither of them knew exactly what the future would hold, one thing was certain. She was no longer standing alone on that platform. The wagon rolled steadily across the open land, and the town slowly disappeared behind them. Eliza kept her hands folded in her lap, but her fingers were no longer trembling the way they had at the station. The wide sky stretched above them, bright and endless. It felt different from the crowded streets she had left behind. Out here, there was space to breathe. Thomas did not rush the horses. He allowed the ride to move at a calm, easy pace. From time to time, he pointed out simple things along the way: a group of cattle grazing in the distance, a line of cottonwood trees near the creek. a small wooden bridge they would cross before reaching the ranch. Eliza listened quietly. She did not say much, but she was paying attention. Her eyes followed wherever he pointed. The land seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful, as if nothing bad could survive in such open sunlight. When they finally reached the ranch, Eliza straightened slightly. The house was not grand, but it was solid and welcoming. It stood 2 stories tall with a wide porch stretching across the front. The wood was sun-faded but sturdy. A rocking chair sat near the door. Smoke curled gently from the chimney, even though the day was warm. Thomas must have lit the stove before leaving that morning. A red barn stood a short distance away, along with a fenced corral. Chickens wandered freely in the yard, clucking softly. A dog lifted its head from near the porch steps and barked once before wagging its tail. "This is it," Thomas said simply. Eliza took in the sight slowly. She had imagined many things during her journey, but this felt steadier than she expected. It did not look like a place where shouting filled the air. It did not look like a place where doors slammed in anger. Thomas climbed down first and walked around to help her again. She accepted his hand more easily this time. When her boots touched the ground, she paused as if testing whether this place would hold her safely. The dog approached her carefully, sniffing her dress before wagging its tail again. Eliza hesitated, then slowly bent down to touch its head. The simple act seemed to calm her. Animals often sense things people could not. "He's friendly," Thomas said. "Name's Scout." She gave the dog a faint smile. It was small, but it was real. Thomas carried her suitcase inside. The house smelled of wood, fresh bread, and something warm cooking on the stove. Sunlight streamed through the windows, lighting up the simple furniture. A sturdy wooden table stood in the center of the main room. Shelves lined one wall, holding neatly stacked dishes. Everything had its place. Eliza stepped inside carefully, as if afraid she might disturb something. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in each detail. There were no broken objects, no signs of chaos, only quiet order. Thomas set her suitcase near the staircase. "I'll show you your room," he said. He led her upstairs to a small but tidy bedroom. A clean quilt covered the bed. A pitcher of water sat on the nightstand beside a small wash basin. The window looked out over the fields where the grass moved gently in the breeze. "You can rest," he said. "No chores today, just settle in." She looked at him as if waiting for more instructions. When none came, she nodded. "If you need anything, I'll be downstairs," he added before stepping back and giving her space. He closed the door softly behind him. For a long moment, Eliza stood in the center of the room without moving. It felt strange to be alone in a quiet space without fear. Slowly she walked to the window and looked outside. The land stretched far into the distance. There were no close neighbors, no narrow alleys, just open prairie. She placed her small suitcase on the bed and opened it. Inside were only a few dresses, a comb, a folded piece of cloth with careful stitching, and a bundle of letters tied with string. She touched the letters briefly, then set them aside. After washing her face and hands, she sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped slightly under her weight. The simple comfort felt unfamiliar. Exhaustion began to settle into her bones. She had not slept properly in many nights. Downstairs, Thomas moved quietly around the kitchen. He kept himself busy, giving her time. He checked the stew on the stove and sliced the bread he had baked that morning. He understood that arriving in a new place could feel overwhelming, especially when someone carried unspoken pain. Hours passed before Eliza came downstairs again. She had changed into a fresh dress, and though the bruises on her arms were still visible, she no longer tried as hard to hide them. Her steps were cautious but steadier. Thomas looked up from the table. "Hungry?" she nodded. They sat across from each other with a simple meal between them. For a while they ate in silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It felt patient. "The ranch keeps me busy," Thomas said after a few minutes. "There's always something to mend or feed." She glanced around the room. It's very neat. He gave a small smile. I try. She hesitated, then asked softly, do you live here alone? Yes, he answered honestly. Have for years. She absorbed that information quietly. Living alone by choice was different from feeling alone without choice. She understood the difference. After the meal, Thomas stood and began clearing the dishes. Eliza immediately rose to help, but he gently shook his head. You don't have to. I'd like to, she said, her voice a little firmer than before. He paused, then nodded. All right. They washed dishes side by side. Their movements were careful around each other at first, but slowly they found a rhythm. Passing plates, drying cups, placing them on the shelf. The simple task felt almost peaceful. Later, Thomas showed her the barn. The horses shifted in their stalls. The scent of hay filled the air. He explained how mornings usually began before sunrise and how evenings were quieter. You won't be expected to do anything you're not ready for, he said. She looked at him closely, as if measuring the truth of his words. Whatever she saw in his expression seemed to ease her slightly. As the sun began to lower in the sky, they returned to the house. The prairie glowed golden under the fading light. Eliza stood on the porch for a long moment, watching the horizon. It's very open, she said. That's what I like about it, Thomas replied. Nothing hidden. The words seemed to settle between them. That evening she found herself speaking more than she had planned. Not everything, not the full story, but pieces of it. She mentioned leaving a place that did not feel safe. She spoke about promises that had not been kept. Her voice trembled once, but she continued. Thomas did not interrupt. He did not press for details. He simply listened. When she finished, he said quietly, "No one will trouble you here." It was not said loudly. It did not need to be. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. The ranch felt steady, grounded. For the first time in a long while, Eliza felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Not fear, not uncertainty. The days at the ranch slowly began to form a gentle rhythm. Morning started with soft light spilling through the windows and the distant sound of cattle moving across the fields. Eliza would wake early, sometimes before the sun fully rose, as if her body was still used to being alert. For the first few days, she often sat up in bed at the smallest sound. But as time passed, she began to recognize the difference between danger and ordinary life. The creak of wood was just the house settling. The thud outside was only a barn door shifting in the wind. Thomas never hurried her. He worked long hours, but he made sure she knew she was free to move at her own pace. Some mornings, she helped gather eggs from the chicken coop. Other times, she simply stood by the fence and watched the horses run. The open land felt like a wide breath that never ended. Slowly, her shoulders relaxed. She spoke more. She even laughed once when Scout, the dog, chased his own tail in circles and fell over in the dirt. The sound of her laughter surprised both of them. It was light and warm, as if it had been waiting for a chance to return. But peace once found can sometimes feel fragile. One afternoon, Thomas rode into town to pick up supplies. Eliza stayed behind, folding clean laundry on the porch. The air was warm and the sky was clear. For the first time since arriving, she felt almost comfortable being alone. When Thomas reached the general store, he noticed something unusual. Two men stood near the entrance, speaking in low voices. One of them was a stranger. He was dressed in travel-worn clothes, his hat pulled low. There was something restless in the way he stood, like a man who had not come for simple shopping. Thomas stepped inside the store, nodding politely to the owner. The usual friendly greeting felt slightly tense. "You got company in town," the store owner said quietly while measuring flour into a sack. Thomas kept his expression neutral, passing through. "Doesn't seem so, been asking questions." "What kind of questions?" The store owner hesitated. "About a woman, young. Recently arrived. Matches the description of someone who stepped off that train with you." Thomas felt a steady heat rise in his chest, but his face remained calm. And what business is it of his? The store owner shrugged slightly. Claims she left without saying goodbye. The words carried weight. Thomas knew enough to understand what they might mean. He paid for his supplies and stepped back outside. The stranger was still there. Their eyes met briefly. In that glance, Thomas saw recognition, not of him, but of the situation. The stranger approached slowly. "You're Thomas Hale?" the man asked. "Yes. I'm looking for someone who came this way, a woman. She was supposed to be under my care." Thomas's jaw tightened slightly at the phrase, "under my care." It sounded less like concern and more like possession. "She's not under anyone's care," Thomas replied evenly. "She's her own person." The stranger gave a short, humorless smile. "She belongs with me." Thomas held his ground. "No one belongs to anyone." The air between them felt heavy. A few townsfolk pretended not to watch, but they were listening carefully. "She left without permission," the stranger continued. "That's not proper." Thomas's voice stayed calm but firm. "If she left, she had a reason." The stranger stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't know her story." "That may be true," Thomas said, "but I know enough." Silence stretched between them. Finally, the stranger spoke again. "I'll be paying your ranch a visit." Thomas did not respond. He simply climbed into his wagon and drove away, his thoughts steady but focused. Back at the ranch, Eliza sensed something before she saw anything. The wind had shifted. The day felt different, as if a shadow had crossed the sun. She stood near the barn when she spotted the wagon approaching. Thomas stepped down, his movements controlled. "There was a man in town," he said gently. "He's asking about you." The color drained from her face instantly. The basket she was holding slipped from her hands and fell into the dirt. "He found me," she whispered. Thomas stepped closer but did not touch her without permission. "He asked questions, that's all." Her breathing became uneven. "He won't stop." Thomas's voice remained steady. "You are not going back." She looked at him, fear clear in her eyes. "You don't understand. He thinks—" "He can think whatever he wants," Thomas interrupted softly but firmly. "That doesn't make it true." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "He won't let this go," Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we'll face it." That night the ranch felt less quiet. Every sound seemed louder. Eliza barely slept. Thomas remained alert, not out of fear but out of readiness. 2 days later, just as the sun reached its highest point, a rider appeared on the horizon. Eliza saw him first. Her hands froze around the cup she was holding. The rider moved closer, dust rising behind him. She recognized the posture, the set of his shoulders. The past she had tried to outrun was now riding straight toward her. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, his expression calm but unyielding. The stranger dismounted and approached. "She's coming with me," he said immediately, not bothering with greetings. Eliza stood in the doorway behind Thomas, her heart pounding. Thomas did not move aside. "That's not your choice." The stranger's voice sharpened. She gave her word. Eliza found her voice. "I left." The man turned toward her. "You don't just leave." "I did," she replied, her voice shaking but firm. The silence that followed felt powerful. Thomas spoke again. "She stays if she chooses." The stranger looked around at the ranch, at the open land, at the house standing solid and still. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. This was not a frightened woman standing alone. This was a woman with someone beside her. "She owes me," he muttered. "She owes you nothing," Thomas said calmly. A few neighboring ranchers had quietly ridden closer, having noticed the tension from afar. They did not speak, but their presence was clear. The town may have been small, but it did not ignore what it understood. The stranger realized he was no longer in control of the situation. After a long moment, he stepped back. "This isn't over." "It is," Eliza said quietly. Her voice was no longer trembling. The man mounted his horse again, casting one final look before turning and riding away. The dust settled slowly. Eliza stood still, her chest rising and falling as if she had just run miles. Thomas turned toward her. "It's done," he said gently. She looked at the empty horizon where the rider had disappeared. For the first time, she felt something stronger than fear. Choice. The past had come to claim her, but it had not succeeded. And as the sun lowered over the prairie that evening, the ranch no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It felt like a place she had chosen to stay. After the rider disappeared beyond the horizon, the ranch grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer filled with fear. It felt steady, like the land itself had taken a deep breath. Eliza stood on the porch long after the dust had settled. Her hands rested lightly on the railing, and her thoughts moved slowly. The past had come close enough for her to see it clearly, but it had not pulled her back. That realization felt powerful and frightening at the same time. Thomas did not rush her inside. He remained nearby, giving her space while still being present. He understood that strength sometimes came in silence. That evening they sat at the kitchen table with a simple meal between them. The fire in the stove crackled softly. For a while neither of them spoke. The events of the day still lingered in the air. Finally, Eliza looked up. "Thank you," she said quietly. Thomas shook his head. "You stood your ground. I wouldn't have been able to before," she admitted. He met her eyes. "But you did today." The words settled deep inside her. She realized he wasn't claiming credit. He wasn't acting like a hero. He was simply reminding her of her own courage. The next morning felt different. The sky was clear, and the wind carried the scent of dry grass and earth. Eliza woke before sunrise, but this time not because of fear. She simply wanted to see the morning light spread across the land. She stepped outside and watched as the first golden rays touched the fields. The ranch looked peaceful, almost glowing. Scout trotted over and sat beside her, as if keeping quiet company. Thomas joined her a few minutes later, holding 2 cups of warm coffee. He handed one to her without a word. They stood side by side, looking out at the open prairie. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It is," he agreed. For the first time, she didn't feel like a visitor. She felt like someone who belonged there. As days turned into weeks, Eliza began to take part in ranch life more naturally. She learned how to mend small tears in fence wire. She gathered eggs each morning and even started organizing the pantry shelves in a way that made sense to her. Thomas noticed the small changes. The house began to reflect her presence. One afternoon she found a patch of soil near the side of the house and asked, "May I plant something here?" Thomas smiled. "It's your home too." Those words stayed with her. She planted simple flowers and a few vegetables. Each day she watered them carefully, watching for the first signs of green pushing through the soil. It felt symbolic, though she didn't say it out loud. Growth took time. Healing did too. Trust between them continued to build in small, steady ways. Thomas always knocked before entering a room she was in. He asked before making decisions that affected both of them. When he spoke, his voice remained calm and even. One evening, a sudden clap of thunder echoed across the sky. A storm rolled in quickly, dark clouds covering the horizon. Eliza froze at the loud sound. For a brief second, old fear flickered across her face. Thomas noticed immediately. "It's just a storm," he said gently. "Happens fast out here." She nodded, trying to steady her breathing. The rain began to fall hard against the roof. Without thinking, she moved closer to the window to watch. The lightning flashed across the fields, bright and powerful. The storm felt wild but natural, not cruel, not directed at anyone. Just part of life on the prairie. "It passes quickly," Thomas added, and it did. Within an hour, the sky cleared again, leaving the land fresh and shining. Eliza realized something important. Not every loud sound meant danger. Not every storm meant harm. Little by little, her reactions softened. They began riding together in the afternoons to check on the cattle. At first, she was hesitant on horseback, but Thomas patiently showed her how to guide the reins and sit steady. The feeling of riding across open land brought a sense of freedom she had never known before. One day, as they paused near the creek, she asked him a question that had been on her mind. "Why did you place the advertisement?" Thomas considered his answer carefully. "I was tired of eating alone," he said honestly, "tired of talking only to cattle and fences. I wanted partnership, not someone to control, just someone to share the work in the quiet." She studied him. "You weren't afraid." "Of what?" "That it might not work." He gave a small shrug. "Life doesn't come with guarantees, but respect should." The simplicity of his words touched her deeply. As the weeks passed, laughter became more common in the house. They shared stories about childhood memories. Eliza spoke about her mother's garden and how she used to sew dresses from leftover fabric. Thomas described learning ranch work from his father and how hard the first winter alone had been. They were no longer strangers learning about each other. They were two people slowly building something steady. One afternoon, Eliza caught her reflection in the small mirror upstairs. The bruises that once marked her skin had faded completely, but what surprised her most was not the clear skin. It was the expression in her eyes. They no longer looked frightened, they looked certain. That evening, while sitting on the porch as the sun dipped low, she turned to Thomas. "I used to think I had no choices," she said quietly. He listened. "I thought my path was decided by others. That if someone said something strongly enough, it became true." She paused. "But that day on the porch, I realized I could say no." Thomas nodded. "You always could." "Maybe," she replied, "but I didn't know it." The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. "Thank you," she said again, but this time her voice was stronger. "For what?" he asked. "For not treating me like something fragile, for letting me find my own strength." He looked out at the land before answering. "You were strong the day you stepped off that train. You just needed space to see it." The sky turned shades of orange and pink as the sun lowered. Eliza leaned back in the rocking chair, feeling steady. The ranch was no longer just a safe place. It had become a place of growth, a place where she was not defined by what had happened before. Trust had not appeared overnight. It had been built through quiet respect, small kindnesses, and shared work. And as the stars slowly began to appear above the prairie, Eliza realized something else. She was no longer healing. The seasons began to change, and with them, so did everything around the ranch. The golden fields of late summer slowly turned into shades of amber and brown. The air grew cooler in the mornings, and a soft mist sometimes hovered above the creek before the sun fully rose. Eliza noticed these changes more than she had expected. Before coming here, she had lived each day simply trying to get through it. Now she found herself paying attention to the details of the world around her. She woke early most mornings, not from fear anymore, but from habit and purpose. She liked stepping outside just as the sky began to lighten. The land felt peaceful at that hour, as if it belonged only to her and the rising sun. Scout would follow her across the yard, his tail wagging lazily. The chickens would cluck softly as she scattered feed for them. Thomas often joined her shortly after, carrying 2 cups of coffee. It had become their quiet routine. They did not always speak, but the silence between them was comfortable. It no longer carried tension. It carried understanding. The small garden she had planted beside the house had begun to flourish. Green shoots pushed up through the soil, and delicate flowers added soft color against the wooden walls. Each time she saw something new grow, she felt a quiet sense of pride. She had planted those seeds herself. She had tended them with patience. One afternoon, as she knelt in the dirt pulling small weeds, Thomas watched her from the porch. There was something steady in the way she moved now. Her hands no longer trembled. Her shoulders no longer curved inward as if trying to disappear. She stood tall without realizing it. Later that evening, she carried a basket of vegetables into the kitchen and placed it on the table. "From our garden," she said with a small smile. Thomas looked at the basket, then at her. "Looks like it's thriving." "So am I," she replied quietly. The words hung in the air for a moment before both of them smiled. Life at the ranch was still hard work. There were fences to repair, animals to care for, and long days under the open sky. But Eliza no longer saw the work as something heavy. It felt meaningful. Every repaired fence meant protection. Every harvested crop meant nourishment. Every shared meal meant connection. The town, which had once whispered about her arrival, began to see her differently. When she rode into town beside Thomas to buy supplies, she held her head high. The shopkeeper greeted her warmly. Neighbors asked about her garden. Slowly, she became part of the community rather than a subject of quiet talk. One day at the general store, a woman approached her. "I heard you've made quite a home out there," she said kindly. Eliza nodded. "I'm trying." "You don't look like someone who's just trying," the woman replied with a smile. "You look like someone who belongs." Those words stayed with her all the way back to the ranch. That night, as the two of them sat by the fire, Eliza spoke thoughtfully. "When I first arrived, I thought I was only running away." Thomas listened carefully. "But now," she continued, "I think I was running towards something." He looked at her. "And what's that?" "A life I choose." The firelight reflected in her eyes, steady and bright. Winter arrived sooner than expected that year. Frost covered the fields in the mornings, turning the grass silver under the rising sun. The work became harder in the cold, but they faced it together. Eliza learned how to stack firewood properly and keep the house warm. She baked bread that filled the kitchen with comforting warmth. Thomas handled the heavier outdoor tasks, but he never treated her as incapable. He simply shared what needed to be done. On especially cold nights, they would sit near the stove, telling stories. Eliza spoke more freely now about her childhood. She described the small village where she grew up, the way her mother used to hum while sewing, the smell of fresh bread cooling by the window. Thomas listened with genuine interest, asking gentle questions. In return, he told her about learning to ride a horse before he could even read properly. He spoke of his father's quiet strength and the long winters that tested patience and resilience. They were no longer two strangers connected by an advertisement. They were partners building a shared history. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, Eliza stood by the window watching the flakes drift down. The world looked peaceful, wrapped in white. She remembered the day she stepped off the train, frightened and unsure. She remembered the bruises on her arms and the fear in her heart. Those bruises were long gone now. The fear had faded too. Thomas joined her at the window. "Cold enough for you?" he asked lightly. She smiled. "I've felt colder." He studied her expression and saw something firm there. Not stubbornness, not defiance, but confidence. "Do you ever regret coming?" he asked quietly. She turned to face him fully. "No," the answer came without hesitation. "I used to think my life would always be decided by others," she continued. "But here I learned that I can choose, I can speak, I can stay." Thomas nodded slowly. "And what do you choose?" She stepped closer, her voice steady. "I'm staying." Not because she had nowhere else to go, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the land in quiet beauty. Inside the ranch house, the fire burned warmly. In the months that followed, their life grew stronger. The ranch expanded slightly. They repaired an old shed and turned it into extra storage. Eliza added curtains to the windows and painted the porch a soft shade of blue in the spring. Each change reflected her touch. The town no longer remembered her as the frightened woman stepping off the train. They saw her riding confidently beside Thomas, managing accounts at the store, laughing freely during community gatherings. Her story spread quietly, not as gossip, but as something hopeful. A reminder that strength can return. That kindness can create space for healing. That protection does not mean control. One warm spring morning, Eliza stood at the edge of the field watching the sun rise. The air smelled fresh and full of promise. Thomas joined her as he always did. She reached for his hand, not out of fear or uncertainty, but out of partnership. The land before them was wide and open. Once, that openness had seemed overwhelming. Now it felt like possibility. She had arrived covered in bruises and quiet pain, but she had become something else entirely. Not someone rescued, not someone hidden, but someone who chose her own future. And on that ranch, under that endless sky, she found not just safety, but dignity, respect, and a life built on her own terms.